We are just a tiny bit late, but I promise Michelle and Lydia, I will keep time and we will finish by 12:10. So thank you, Malcolm and Greg. We have such an incredible session now. We have, a practitioner and an academic, both very experienced in this field, looking at so important and topical issues. So our first speaker is Malcolm Haddon from Multicultural New South Wales. I think most of us know Malcolm. So the title of his session is De-escalating Hate, Sikh Separatism, Hindu Nationalism, and the Shadow of Communal Violence among Australia's Indian Communities. Thank you, Malcolm.
Thanks, Matteo. Okay. My presentation today is attempting to describe a problem. If I get through this 20 minutes and have demonstrated we have a problem, I would have done my job. That's really all I'm trying to achieve in this paper. It's a problem that we've been dealing with in New South Wales or Sydney pretty intensely for the last 3 years, in fact, relating to growing escalation of tensions within Australia's Indian communities, or our communities, at least in Sydney and New South Wales, relating to the activities of a resurgent Sikh Khalistan separatist movement and an emboldened far-right Hindu nationalist movement. We've been dealing with violence, intimidation, protests and counter-protests, clashes, threats, intimidation, and a vile online environment in which hate has been escalating to the nth degree in online environments. In describing any problem, I suppose, depends on the position and the relation of the observer to what's being described. This is obviously a very topical issue. I submitted this abstract before the Canadian Prime Minister announced the Canadian government's suspicions around potential political assassination of the Seeks for Justice representative in Canada. I'm going to try and keep this as local as I can. That's beyond my pay grade, beyond my security clearance. I'm going to try and keep this and talk about how this issue has played out on the ground as a practitioner in Sydney, particularly in New South Wales broadly. But I do recognise this is not simply a Sydney, New South Wales issue. It's been playing out in other Australian jurisdictions as well, here in Melbourne, in Brisbane, in Queensland, and internationally, as we've seen in Canada, but also in the UK as well. But to the best extent possible, I'm going to come at it from a local perspective and really just present a case study of what we've been dealing with in Sydney and New South Wales over the last few years. It's a practitioner's perspective. As Matteo said, we've got Greg as our expert on this session. I'm the practitioner. I don't pretend to be an expert. If you do go and ask an expert, I'm sure they will tell you that the history of Sikh separatism and the desire for a separate Sikh state in the Punjab called Khalistan has a long history. It does have a history of terrorism and violent extremism. It's got a history of political assassinations itself with Indira Gandhi. It has the worst aviation terrorism incident with the Air India bombing before 9/11. There is a history of terrorism and violent extremism in this movement. Today, the movement is trying to take the semblance of a democratic process through the institution of a series of unofficial referenda that they want to actually take to the UN to petition for a separate state. On the other side, the actions of historically, the actions of the Indian state against the Khalistan movement have also seen really severe reprisal in the form, particularly of the 1984 Operation Blue Star and the horrendous atrocities that were committed that have created deep scars in the psyche of the Sikh population across the diaspora. And we've seen violence on both sides. On the extreme Hindu nationalist side, there's also clearly a history of communal violence within India as well. And that's a reality. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert around that. Again, I want to talk about how some of these issues are coming to play at the local issue. I want to talk a little bit, if I have the time, from a policy perspective, I'll talk a little bit about the approach that we take at Multicultural New South Wales from our community resilience framework. I'm also working with other agencies very closely with this, particularly the New South Wales Police Force and more recently with the Department of Home Affairs around this. Each agency comes to work with their own kind of perspective. I'm going to talk about our role in particular from that perspective. I want to talk a little bit about how this issue might fit within a countering violent extremism framework. And I will say that I think we are dealing with politically motivated violent extremism, but whether our current frameworks are actually fit for purpose in terms of addressing this kind of scope of issue, I think is another issue. There's also overlays as well in a policy sense around some of the current work around countering foreign interference. And there's certainly accusations amongst communities around foreign interference, but also some of that blurred distinction, I think, between CVE and CFI, because you don't necessarily need a foreign state actor to be interfering for someone to be inspired by a racial or religious nationalist ideology and fervour and zealousness. You don't necessarily need the direction of the state to that still have the same effect and ripple effect on communities and community cohesion. A multicultural perspective as well. I'm from Multicultural New South Wales. I'll talk a little bit about what that means. What it also means is that we are a multicultural society. Australia is a multicultural society. That means we're connected to the world. That connection brings all kinds of social, economic and cultural benefits to this country, of course, and that certainly applies to the history of migration from the Indian subcontinent. And we value that, that connection and the social and economic benefits that brings to this country. But we can't just talk about the assets and the benefits of migration without actually also acknowledging the history of trauma that many migrant refugee communities bring with them to this country. And in the case of the Indian subcontinent, of course, the trauma of colonialism, the trauma of partition with the creation of India and Pakistan, and how that's also played out in relation to the issue around the call for a separate Sikh state there as well, and particularly for the Sikh community, the trauma of 1984 and Operation Blue Star. You can't just take the benefits and ignore all of the other elements that make people people as well in terms of their histories. Just a little bit about Multicultural New South Wales. Multicultural New South Wales is a statutory authority in New South Wales. We've existed in some form or another for about 40 years. We have legislation. There's similar legislation in Victoria and other jurisdictions in Australia too. Our legislation enshrines the multicultural principles as a policy of the state in New South Wales. In summary, the multicultural principles call on all individuals and institutions to share democratic values governed by the rule of law and to promote a unified commitment to Australia, its interests and its future, to accept and value the fact that New South Wales is a culturally, linguistically and religiously diverse society, and to respect our democratic freedoms, to practice our cultural and religious traditions and to speak our languages. Now, a couple of things about these points. From a CVE perspective, extremists hate these principles. Okay, and traditionally in Australian CVE, we've been dealing with people who hate Australia. Doesn't matter which spectrum you're on, whether you're an ISIS-inspired extremist or a white nationalist, you hate Australia. You hate the fact that Australia is multicultural. Okay, you hate diversity. You hate democracy. Okay, it's one of the common. So one of the reasons my agency is involved in CVE is because extremists are against everything we stand for as an agency. The other thing to note is that actually these principles, this is a summary of them, there's about 6 of them, are actually based on the UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It's actually a human rights framework beyond the commitment to Australia and its interests. It's actually a human rights framework that gives us the foundation for the work that we do. The other thing I will say is that the legislation recognises cultural, linguistic and religious diversity, and we engage communities on the basis of culture, language and religion, not on the basis of nationality. Engaging on the basis of nationality is the job of foreign affairs and of nation states. Okay, we engage communities on the basis of culture, language and religion. And in fact, it's the conflation of culture, language and religion with nationality that is part of the problem that we're dealing with here at the moment. And that's a really important point to distinguish there as well. For us, the multicultural principles are the foundation for an inclusive, socially cohesive, multicultural society, and that's our vision as an agency. I'm the Associate Director for Community Resilience. Community Resilience is one of the strategic priorities for our agency under our strategic plan, which we define as expanding robust relationships with communities and between communities that can inspire people to foster social cohesion, stand united against divisive forces and to come together in times of need. That's our strategic priority that my team leads, and I've got members of my team here I'd like to acknowledge here as well that help us deliver on that priority. We adopt a resilience-based approach to community resilience. I've spoken here last year about we don't adopt a public health model of primary prevention in the work we do. We adopt a resilience model, which actually is borrowed from disaster resilience, which talks not only about prevention, but about preparedness, prevention, response, and recovery arrangements. We've operationalised that concept through a number of programs, but also through a number of frameworks and plans, most notably the New South Wales Community Resilience and Response Plan, which is a whole of government plan that Multicultural New South Wales leads, that sets out arrangements under those PPRR arrangements that are focused on addressing and identifying risks to community harmony in New South Wales. It recognises that those risks can arise from local, state, national or international issues, and that local issues for community harmony in New South Wales can also have local, state, national or international consequences as well. That's just a summary of some of the response arrangements there, but of course the plan covers all of the PPRR spectrum. What I'll be talking about now is a case study in which we've been working under the comp plan arrangements that we've been, particularly since August 2020, where we really have been in response phase around some of the issues that I've outlined here as well. So beginning in August 2020 in Harris Park in Sydney, some people like to call Little India, it's become a little bit complicated now, calling it that. I'm going to show you a little clip that tells the story better than I can.
A man has pleaded guilty over his involvement in a street brawl between members of Sydney's Indian community. For some bizarre reason, the fight was shared on the popular dance app TikTok.
A wild and dangerous dance organised and uploaded on TikTok. In August last year, 40 men went head-to-head in Harris Park. Ongoing rivalry between two local community groups saw fists and feet go flying. Some brawlers armed with cricket bats and steel rods. Did you know the other men involved?
Actually, I have no idea. Like, what happened there? I have no idea.
One man knocked out cold, bleeding from the head. Manhar Singh is one of 3 people charged. Did you see the call out on TikTok?
I never used TikTok.
Never used TikTok?
No.
Today in court, the 31-year-old from Jordan Springs pleaded guilty. Have you been in brawls before?
No, really.
Are you sorry for what you did? Manhar Singh has pleaded guilty to driving recklessly and common assault. He remains on bail and will be sentenced next month. What do you think will happen at sentencing?
I don't know. What are you talking about? I have no idea.
Got nothing to say.
2 other men charged have yet to enter pleas and will face a magistrate next week. Natasha Squarey.
Those 2 other men charged, just to jump forward to this month, actually, over the last 3 years, the New South Wales Police Engagement Hate Crimes Unit has been developing a case that has taken to the Director of Public Prosecutions. Don't you love that dance app, TikTok? Yeah, that's what it is. Around new provisions in the New South Wales Crimes Act, called Section 90, we call it Section 93Z, which is publicly threatening and inciting violence on the basis of race, religion, and other grounds as well. And this is the first test case of that law. The law was actually introduced after lobbying by the Jewish community to strengthen provisions around serious racial vilification and to make that and to talk about publicly threatening and inciting violence as a threshold. The first test case, interestingly, has involved this issue. And after 3 years of really dedicated work, the New South Wales Police have actually managed to land the first conviction under that law in the last few weeks as well. A Hindu and a Sikh, both convicted under the Section 93Z law. So that's a really interesting milestone and the result of a lot of work. But if I go back to August 2020, we've activated our comp plan arrangements, and we've been bringing agencies together, particularly in New South Wales Police and Multicultural New South Wales, through a whole series of incidents. And I probably won't run through each of them, but it started with the Harris Park affray. We've seen individual assaults, groups assaulting each other, Hindu on Sikh, Sikh on Hindu. We're seeing, this is also around the time that in India we saw protests around against the Indian government's introduction of new laws that were impacting farmers in the Punjab, and protests by Sikhs worldwide, and there were protests happening on the streets. And then we saw Hindu nationalists that were trying to disrupt those protests, and that was leading to clashes on the ground as well. We saw a really serious assault of a man in Harris Park with a baseball bat, had his limbs broken. He was actually a Hindu, but he'd been critical of Prime Minister Modi and the BJP party on social media, and was warned that if he kept it up, he'd be in trouble, and that's exactly what happened. Car rallies, flag-waving car rallies, Hindu nationalist car rallies. And then for the next case, I'll show you quickly too. I'll show you the next case in a minute. We worked with community leaders throughout this time. Our strategy at that time was to try and bring Hindu and Sikh community leaders together to try and actually see how we could de-escalate this issue. It was a very difficult process to bring them together around that time. We managed to actually develop a joint statement of unity that for us was criticised by some as being a kind of symbolic gesture, but for us was actually an attempt to hold community leaders accountable. That once you've signed your name to this, we will hold you accountable to that. And if you attempt to apply for funding to Multicultural New South Wales and you haven't been adhering to the statement that you signed, then there might be consequences for that as well. Second incident in February 21, I'll show you a quick clip of this.
A man has been remanded in custody over a series of violent gang attacks at Harris Park in Sydney's West. Police allege that Sikhs, identified by their turbans, were targeted because of tensions in India.
A breakthrough in the hunt for these armed thugs. Vishal Jude was allegedly behind this violent rampage and a series of other hate crimes in Harris Park.
They could have killed somebody on that night. So we could have like a loss of a life.
The damage to one car alone at $10,000. The crime wave began in September last year when a man was bashed by up to 5 men at Harris Park, struck in the head with a baseball bat and kicked. On February 14, a Range Rover driver was targeted. And later that month is when police allege the Chrysler owner was attacked by up to 10 people armed with weapons. Yesterday, police raided a home in Parramatta, making their first arrest.
Now, like we can say, like we are safe because of the New South Wales police. We really appreciate the hard work.
The victims, Sikhs, believe they were targeted because of their turbans. Debate over farming laws in India fueling tensions here.
And it's a shame for the community that we are dealing with these sort of crimes within our own community.
Vishal Jude didn't come up from the cells today when his matter was briefly mentioned in court. He didn't apply for bail and it was formally refused.
I've got to skip through that. So Vishal Jude, the person who was arrested in that case, I'm running out of time here, put into immigration detention where he continued using his phone to incite hatred online. Was eventually convicted and spent 6 months in jail before he was deported back to India. During that time he was in prison, there was online campaigns suggesting that he was wrongly imprisoned, that he was being tortured by New South Wales police, which is untrue, clearly manifestly untrue. We had ministers in the Indian government, the BJP, campaigning for his release on unjust grounds. We had the head of the BJP party writing to Barry O'Farrell as Australia's ambassador to India, making the same case. All of this was unfounded criticism. This guy was a thug and a criminal and served his time. He's gone home a hero to India as well on the back of that incident in February 2021. Skipping through, I'm going to quickly jump through now to the last 6 months or more in Australia, actually, but just how it's played out in New South Wales as well. The Sikhs for Justice movement, the North American-based movement, and we're seeing a lot of the news about that in Canada at the moment, has been out here in Australia trying to stage a series of unofficial referenda on inviting the Sikh community to come and vote on whether there should be a separate state of Khalistan in the Punjab. So it's the semblance of democratic process, but it has no actual official standing. A referendum was held here in Melbourne in January, in which counter-protesters turned up and they led to violence on the streets of Melbourne. 2 minutes. Same thing happened in Brisbane, where we had the referendum was held peacefully in Brisbane with about, how many thousand people did you have there? About 12,000. The Sydney one was timed to coincide with the visit of the Prime Minister Narendra Modi to Sydney. Originally it was going to be the Quad meeting and ended up becoming a bilateral meeting with Modi. And so it was obviously carefully timed to coincide around that. So we saw a real escalation of all of these issues that I've been talking about in the lead up to Modi's visit in May and then the planned referendum on the 4th of June. I won't go through all of the details of how that escalated, but certainly there was assaults, there was violence, there was protests and counter-protests. The organisers tried 4 times to book a venue to hold the referendum, and had venues cancelled on them for fear of how this might play out. Understandably, if you're a venue owner, that would be a potentially frightening prospect. Eventually, it took place on a industrial property out in Minchinbury in Western Sydney, and was very peaceful. Police estimate 23,000 people turned up to vote. Potentially the community estimates up to 30,000. The people participating in the referendum behaved impeccably and cooperated with New South Wales Police, not even a scrap of rubbish on the ground. Despite all of the engagement that we did with communities, and we followed the lead of Queensland here in doing joint engagement with Home Affairs, New South Wales Police, with both Hindu and Sikh communities, unfortunately, counter-protesters did turn up. With carloads of tomahawk axes, knives, poles, baseball bats, and waving flags. And if we hadn't been doing about 6 months of engagement and police hadn't been prepared with a very significant police response there, we could have been looking at a really bloody incident there. But thankfully, 2 arrests were made at the time. And hopefully that gives you a sense anyway of some of the issues, because I've run out of time, that we've been dealing with and the scale of the issue. What I did want to say from a CVE perspective is that this might not always come up on a CVE radar, because we often conflate violent extremism with terrorism and the terrorism risk. But just to remind everyone that our definition nationally of violent extremism in Australia is not only about the use of extremist violence, it's also about supporting others who use extremist violence, which is the cheer squad kind of effect that we talk about, who are violent extremists by this definition. And also to say that we're not only talking about terrorism, we are talking about politically motivated violence like violent protests, and some forms of communal violence like racially motivated assaults. This clearly fits within that definition of violent extremism. But why it might not get the attention that it always does, because just probably from a governance apparatus, we kind of operate under counter-terrorism arrangements, and our priorities tend to be dictated from a preventative counter-terrorism perspective. I'm going to leave it there because I've run out of time. Thanks, Matteo.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. Such a great presentation. Now it's the time for Professor Greg Barton. We have a presentation on hateful extremism, populism, and far-right supremacism in Indonesia, Malaysia, Australia, and the United States. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Matteo. Yes, please do keep time. This is, needless to say, an overly ambitious topic with not enough time, too many slides. So I'm not going to drill into detail too much because other speakers will be speaking to me the same details that I'm touching on, but it's to provoke thought and to hopefully set in place some conversations for the next 3 days. It was excellent starting with J.M. Berger, because that framing is a really good way of thinking about the issues, and I'll be touching on some of the things he said. Right, so just realised that our slide thing here minimises the slides so you can't read them. But anyway, that's another problem. On a light note, one of Australia's most significant and arguably destructive exports, of course, to the US is Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch is not a fascist. He's not a violent extremist. And he doesn't even necessarily promote hateful extremism directly, but he certainly facilitates. There's a complicated story there. And his son, Lachlan, who's taking over the business, does have some friendships with people who are much more clearly engaged. I'm thinking of people like Tucker Carlson. Of course, we know that in this sort of enabling space that Fox News in America is not as powerful as often we fear it to be, but it's not nothing either. It's consequential. And when people like Tucker Carlson, who's now ex-Fox, thankfully, promote a great replacement thesis, that's really destructive. It's really pernicious and feeds into the problem. And it reverberates in Australia too in very direct ways. I'm sure you're familiar with the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. We're talking about that a lot. It is one of the common elements. I would just say that it's not simply white supremacist thinking. I mean, it's known best in white supremacist circles, but it's a universal issue that manifests in different concentrations, to be fair, in different ways. Any group is, as JM said, is capable of framing things in terms of an inside and outside group, and feeling that they cannot exist if they don't take on the group that they feel is their enemy. And of course, it's not just a question of hate and unpleasantness. It can be murderous. I mean, the Christchurch attack, needless to say, 51 people kneeling in prayer, killed in cold blood, and another 50 injured, is the worst possible manifestation you can imagine. And in some ways, it came out of blue sky without warning, and yet in other ways, we had a hateful extremist turned violent extremist overnight. And theoretically, we could have seen it coming, but I don't think anyone realistically says that we've got the mechanisms to see that coming. And how do you spot that? But that's something we need to wrestle with. It's not the only reason we're looking at this, but it's one reason to think about this. Of course, the Christchurch Australian terrorist was not the first person to do this, nor was Anders Breivik in Norway in 2011, but he was certainly one of the most significant people in recent years. The scale of his lone actor attack was awful, gunning down innocent kids at a youth camp, as well as bombing up government buildings in downtown Oslo. And of course, after Christchurch, we saw, there's been numerous follow-up attacks all around this Great Replacement thesis idea. So El Paso in Texas was one. I said that it's not, this Great Replacement thesis is not simply just white supremacist. I mean, I think there's a very clear case that Hindutva extremism in India fits into Great Replacement thinking, and it's not about white supremacists. You could go back and look at historical links between the rise of European fascism, National Socialism, and links with India. It's a complicated story, but this is a human problem with human communities around the world. Admittedly, a lot of people who rally behind BJP are not intent on violence, but there's that potential there, and there's certainly a lot of violence, a lot of lynching, a lot of hate crimes as well in India. Buddhism, you would think, would be safe from this problem, because what is more compassionate, caring, tolerant, open-minded than Buddhism? Well, it turns out that any human belief system, any religion certainly is capable of being twisted, and we're talking about the twisting of religions here. So Myanmar speaks to that. Not all Buddhist leaders in Myanmar, in fact, most of them are against the violence, but some have facilitated it. And of course, not all hate follows this structured form of extremism. I mean, hateful extremism, I think we're defining, looking at Matteo, who's done leading work in this space, is about an organized framing, justifying hate and using hate to justify actions. Anti-Asian hate crimes in the US, which have spiked in recent years, particularly during the COVID period, are not necessarily framed around an orchestrated hateful extremism, but there's obviously a lot we don't know, a lot of overlap. So this is a rough definition for thinking about violent and hateful extremism, which is a way of trying to encompass the sort of violent end of the spectrum with stuff that's not necessarily violent, may lead to violence. There are familiar elements of talking about great replacement, but also toxic masculinity is almost invariably a feature. It's not defined by toxic masculinity, but it's a pretty common reoccurring element. Forgive my graphic design skills, which are very minimal. This is not an ad for lunch. It's New York bagels. It's what I'm trying to say with this is that we know that there's a difference between hateful extremism and violent extremism. I think it's helpful to think about the difference between conflict violence and violent extremism. So in a war zone where there's insurgencies, you have people caught up in conflict violence. Think of Somalia, unfortunately, to this day. And we saw quite a lot of that in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan. It overlaps to a substantial extent with violent extremism, terrorist groups. Hateful extremism sometimes overlaps completely, but mostly it's the Venn diagram, if you could draw one properly, would show a degree of overlap. And Matteo's done a lot of work on this question of hate and hateful extremism. So just a shout out to the Countering Hate website, which has a lot of good material there. Another site that has some really useful material we've seen just emerged since 2020 is the spin-off from the Southern Poverty Law Centre. A couple of their researchers launched this site looking at global hate. And I think it's some really useful provocations. Last year, they launched a report on hateful extremism in Australia, which is, I think, a really good starting point to think about these things. And of course, we come at a time when this question of hate is front and centre of what we're watching in our news cycle, sadly. It's deeply tragic and I think unnecessary that the campaigning at various points of view regarding the Voice to Parliament referendum is dominated by hate, and not just misinformation, but disinformation, deliberate bad behaviour. And not just by the usual suspects, by people who think of themselves as beyond that, middle class, nice people like us, who might buy Indigenous artwork on their wall as they decry cultural elites. And of course, there's a real context to this. This is beyond the scope of what we're doing here, but it's important to mention this anyway, that frontier massacres, more than 10,000 people killed, hundreds and hundreds of attacks up until less than 100 years ago, arguably much less. And 1 in 3 Indigenous Australians were victims directly or descending from victims of stolen generations, and that has massive ongoing consequences. So this is not just a theoretical thing. Nevertheless, the campaign, such as it is around the Voice to Parliament, has taken on this very hateful dimension, and lots of people have jumped on board. So recent protests over the weekend, this last weekend, we saw not just campaigning with disinformation against the Voice, but also folding it in with other kind of conspiracy theories of the day, 15-minute cities and COVID vaccines and 5G cell towers, which are terribly dangerous, as you would be aware. And we've then seen actual neo-Nazis jump on board. We saw this during the COVID pandemic with strange references to America, which shows you the power of social media, because these things haven't come out of, I'm arguing there's a lot of substance in Australian history to support this, but it's also accelerated and changed by social media coming particularly out of American social media circles, and a deliberate cynical strategy now with the referendum of doubling down on the leader of the opposition says, if you don't know, vote no. Okay, kind of a legitimate and effective political tactic, but the hate that goes with it is the problem. And using material from decades of problematic disinformation campaigns, and some stuff that is just truly abhorrent. And this is a minority element, a fringe element, if you like, within this, but it's a pretty significant fringe element that reverberates, and it reverberates against a much larger, more mainstream element of Australian society, white Australia thinking. I want to touch on one manifestation of genuine neo-Nazi behaviour that speaks to the depth in Australian society, that sort of reminds us that this is not coming out of nowhere. It's not a recent thing. That's not just an import. You may have followed the ABC podcast on Firebomb. If not, I would recommend it. It's great. Yeah, really helpful to understand. By one of the presenters is Crispian Chan, whose parents' restaurant, the Manlin, was firebombed when he was just 8 years old, and he unpacks what that means growing up Chinese in Perth, and unfortunately skinhead violence and other things in the city at the time. It was really significant. And I think even a lot of researchers on violent extremism probably didn't pay, at least if you're like me, pay that much attention to this, probably the longest running terror campaign in Australian history. Longest running because today, if you tried it, you get shut down much faster, but this thing went on for a long time. A guy called Jack Van Tongeren, who ironically, perhaps significantly, his mum and dad were born in Indonesia of Indo-Eurasian parentage, and he grew up with all sorts of issues, served in the Vietnam War problematically, but then went double down on full-blown Nazi behaviour, launching a series of poster campaigns, keep Asians out. Australia's been swamped by Asians. This is the late 80s in Perth, but also firebombing 5 Chinese restaurants and at the same time going on a crime spree to fund this whole process. It was the crime spree that put him undone because police discovered a safe house full of stolen equipment. They literally stayed inside the safe house until somebody came back to it, arrested this guy who was the treasurer for the group, and then he turned, and that was the way they focused on Jack Van Tongeren and finally arrested him. He served time through the 1990s, was out in the early 2000s, but it took 9 months from the first firebombing before they got onto Jack. And there's some suggestion, and you could argue the details, that racism in the police force and other problems meant that it wasn't given the resources as quickly as it should have been. Of course, also, we didn't know about far-right extremist terrorism at the time. We didn't have a way of framing this. So this is why it was the longest-running terror campaign in Australia, because after Jack came out in 2002, there were 4 more restaurants firebombed, not by him, as it turned out, but by others inspired by him. But when he was arrested, he had plans to carry out more bombing attacks on restaurants. He then was put in jail pending a hearing, then put out on bail. On bail, he fled bail. It was rearrested, and then finally was allowed free on the grounds that he leave Western Australia, which is a strange result. There's no question that he is a full-blown neo-Nazi. That the background is pretty clear. Today, he's living on a bush block near Loxton in Murray Riverland in South Australia. There's another family that was living on a bush block that Josh will speak about tomorrow, I think, the Wiambilla case. No direct connection, but it's interesting. The blocky thing is a whole story. But going back to sort of more mainstream extremism, most of you would know, some guests maybe this is vague memory, of Pauline Hanson giving a maiden speech in Parliament in 1996. And she said that we're being swamped by Asians. 20 years later, she was re-elected to the Senate, and she was asked about her views. She gave a similarly explosive new maiden speech then, and has doubled down on her views. She's still a force in politics today. Of course, she was a fringe element in 96, but in 2001, when John Howard faced an election that he thought he might lose, he deliberately pivoted, I would argue, to pick up on Pauline Hanson's elements of great replacement thesis, and this line about people arriving by boat seeking refuge. He said, "We will decide who comes to this country and what circumstances." Long story there. I won't go into it. You know the details, but that's a shift from the fringe to the mainstream. Arguably, an element of lawful extremism coming in. Yep. I want to briefly touch on some developments in Malaysia and Indonesia, just to speak to the fact that this is not simply a white Christian, white nationalist problem. You may have been paying attention to Malaysian politics lately. It's got more interesting in recent years because after 6 decades of no change, suddenly there's been a lot of change. Anwar Ibrahim, who was jailed 3 times, is now Prime Minister. Long story, I won't go into it, but it's seen the rise of the party PAS, which is an Islamist party associated with the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, but also an ultra-nationalist party, at least in some elements. So reference to a green wave. There were 6 elections in 6 peninsular states in August, which saw predictably the 3 states that had strong Malay majorities, ethnic Malay majorities, being big wins for PAS. I'll come back to the green wave in a minute, but there's certainly inside PAS an element of hateful extremism in terms of part of its political opportunism, part of its conviction, but a lot of activity on social media. So seizing on things like music concerts and saying, we want the Department of Religious Affairs to be involved in determining which concerts should occur in Malaysia. And then more explicitly targeting the leading opposition party, or now member of the government, DAP, which is a Chinese ethnic majority party with their symbol of the rocket, and then saying these are parasites who are riding on the back of the government. This is hateful extremism. Extremists within PAS are fond of arguing that their enemies are against Malay values, that they're kafir, that they're chauvinists, that they're communists. But of course, if anyone dares to make the suggestion that maybe some of these PAS radicals are sort of a bit like the Taliban, they get very, very upset. But the youth leader of PAS after the fall of Kabul, when the Taliban came to power 2 years ago, was quick to say in a formal statement that we recognise this victory, this independence is achieved by the people of Afghanistan, throwing off 2 decades of colonialism, and then a pretty unambiguous endorsement of the Taliban. It's problematic since through this election campaign, Malaysia, a general election November of last year, and this state elections in August. TikTok has been used for a lot of hate speech, very problematic. Anwar Ibrahim has been targeted because he's a complicated character. He does have a history himself as a young man as an Islamist activist, but has more recently, well, for decades, including long periods in jail, read a lot. He's a thoughtful, interesting guy, and that makes him a target for disinformation, saying, well, something's very strange with this kind of Malay Muslim leader that he would have these friends. He was recently speaking at the UN, gave a great speech at the UN, but that's more fuel to his critics. He for himself came out during last year's election and the state elections this year, speaking about Malaysia Madani, which is a very Indonesian borrowing. He borrowed it from Nicholas Majid, an Indonesian intellectual, because it means a cosmopolitan Malaysia, basically. But I think it's part of his genuine conviction. The Green Wave can be largely explained in terms of ethnic Malay votes. PAS was for a long time a party that couldn't form government, couldn't play. It has been involved in government in recent years, but this swing is to do with the collapse of support for UMNO, the United Malay National Organisation, which has had major corruption scandals. You may have heard of 1MBD and hundreds of millions of dollars being embezzled by former Prime Minister Najib. So the ethnic aspect explains that to a large extent. Indonesia is more complex and probably more robust. It hasn't had the communal politics go the same way, but you'll recall large street rallies at the end of 2016 focusing on Chinese Christian governor of Jakarta who was running for election the following year. And he was accused of blasphemy and in fact served 2 years in jail because of that. The group behind it, the Islamic Defenders Front, was eventually banned. And at the same time, another group, Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia, which was ironically started by Australians who had moved to Indonesia, and was one of the largest Hizbut Tahrir groups anywhere, it was also banned. The government didn't do a good job of explaining the reasons for the ban. I think they should have said it was about hateful behaviour, but they gave the impression it was about hateful ideas, and I think banning ideas is always problematic for a democracy. But the days when they could fill up a sports stadium with 700,000 people, protesting for a caliphate have gone. But and I'll conclude on this. The remaining concern is that there is like PAS, a Tabia Ikhwani Muslim Brotherhood party in Indonesia that has radical elements both in its convictions and its behaviour. This is seen mostly with something called Perda Sharia, which is local bylaws, which makes it very problematic for many people, women particularly. Just in conclusion, recent polling from last year shows that a confusing story in Indonesia. Most people think that Sharia is a good idea, but then it's sort of like saying, are the 10 Commandments a good idea? Well, who can say they're not? It's all in the details. But when you drill down and look at the definitions, conflicting stories, support for the idea that the government should ban extremist groups, and yet sort of strange level of support for the idea that the government should support Islam over other religions. I should point out that support for all parties, only 10%, less than 10% of people say they have a strong link with a political party, and PKS only gets less than 10% of the vote. So we're talking about sort of, margins at the area here. In that polling, anti-Chinese attitudes are still very problematic. And it needs to be put in the context that radical Islamist parties like PKS are in a very much minority position. And the shell's got an itchy throat or something. It's troubling. So yes, that's all from me. Thank you.